was under Chris's control.
He can turn it on back there.
But I said, he can turn me off. Is that it?
He can turn you off.
You both have one?
We're sharing.
Okay.
He can mute you.
Oh, I see. You just need one. Okay.
Thank
All
you,
right,
sir.
we're looking at the fish gates. We're looking at the gates, really. You got them, gates. And the gates. And the gates. Now let me ask this. We're going to see in a little bit about the rebuilding of the wall and who was involved doing that and who did what and what gate and who did what section. How many people can remember their grandmother and the great-grandmother? The great-grandmother? Does anybody remember a great-great-grandmother? 3 generations grandmas. So the grandmother, the great-grandmother, and the great-great-grandmother. It's not uncommon. When we look at the outline and the text, what do we see? Who did such and such a gate? And it lists the relatives that were involved in that. Why do you think that's important? Why do you think it's important that we have a listing of who did what?
Well, it gives us a lineage. So, like in the case of David, we can go back.
Very good.
In the case of Christ, we can go back to David, and so on and so forth.
All right, we can trace the lineage. We can trace the lineage. And that's important. That's important because really in the days of biblical things, just certain peoples did certain things. And that wasn't your stuff. You didn't mess with that. Other family members, people in the tribe, like the tribe of Benjamin, in this case, the tribe of Judah. What else would be involved, you think, in having a record of who did what?
Well, you touched on a minute ago the tribal piece of it. The tribe of Levi, or the tribe of priests, they can trace it back. Okay, yeah, I belong to the tribe of priests. It also tells where you came from.
Yeah, where you came from. I think about this too. I remember growing up that my grandmother and my great-grandmother would talk about certain things. Now, I tried to figure that out. Well, I did figure that out. My great-grandmother died when she was 92 in 1950. So that means that she would have been born when? 1852. Now think about her grandmother and her great-grandmother. I mean, we're talking back in the 1700s. Does anybody here track what they call it, the genealogies? Anybody track genealogies? My sister does that like the people lived yesterday, like they just lived down the street, been dead 300 years. But here's the thing, can you imagine that you're walking around Jerusalem after the walls have been built and the gates have been built and time has gone by, and so now you're the grandpa or the great-grandpa or some kid you're taking along by the hand. I remember walking across High Street with my grandfather holding on to his thumb. Anybody have memories like that? Of those kind of dear things? So here you are walking through Jerusalem with your grandson, and you go along here and you say, now, you see this work? You see this gate? You see this building? It was your great-great-great-grandpa that did that. He set these rocks up and put these things in place and built this 3/4 of a mile section of the wall. And here's who helped him. So they could look at all that stuff. And it was important during the time of Old Testament things that everybody knew where they belonged and who they belonged to, like Steve was saying. We're going to see a little later, I know some of you have already read ahead, and as you read ahead and you see what's going to happen. Anybody read ahead to see what's going to happen with this book of Nehemiah? What's the final result if you've read down there far enough? Those that don't belong are going to be what? Put out of the city. Now, how did they know who should be put out? because they had records of who was the people that were supposed to be there. And it says in a couple of places there were no records found for this family and this family and this family. And they were put out of the city. Now, I suppose the three officials that they kept having troubles with, well, they didn't want the walls to be rebuilt. You suppose they knew what was coming? That once the walls were built? I think they did. And they were governors, were they not? When you talk about these three leading people that kept giving him problems, they were governors of the land. And who did they govern under? Who were they answering to? Well, they were answering to the same king that Nehemiah was answering to. Nehemiah became the governor of what? Yeah. But others were of other lands, and they knew it was coming. They knew what was coming. When you think about the gates being built, as I've said, we won't look at each detail about the gates being built, of who did what, but it is interesting. It wasn't just he went back and built, but you know, when you look up 2.5 miles, roughly 2.5 mile wall that was being built. And with that wall built, how long did it take to build it? You've been reading that. 52 days. With the wall built and the gates in place, what would happen? Nobody would enter that was not supposed to be there. If you've looked at some pictures, you can call them up on your computer or on your cell phone about the pictures of the gates and how they looked. I already going to Germany all those years ago, and you know, when we talked about gates, you know, I thought about gates, you know, like what you see in the old forts, like in the old West movies. They were just, you know, put up with wooden poles, and you had a wooden gate, and that was a gate. But when you see the walls and the gates and in Jerusalem, when you see this wall that was being built, like I say, 2.5 miles roughly, well, 2.4, don't exactly, roughly 2.5 miles, but not only was the gate, the walls 2.5 miles, they were consistently about 39 feet tall. That is a pretty tall wall. And not only was the wall approximately 39 feet tall, it was 8.5 feet wide. So we're talking about a monumental building project. It wasn't just, you know, here's a few stones stacked. Look at those pictures that you can find online about what this wall looked like. Do you ever think about, I'm thinking about the spies that went, and who lived in the wall? What was her name? Yes, Deanna Rahab. She lived in the wall. The wall was 8 foot wide. They had rooms. And when you had the gates, there was the outer gate and the inner gate, and you kept people out that you didn't want in. So here are these people that they continued to deal with, these local area governors, and they knew what was coming. So they tried to discourage them. They tried to prevent them from building. And they knew once the wall was built, they were gone. So they made it as difficult as possible. And we said last week in passing, we'll study it more as the chapters develop, but they finally armed themselves. And they did one working and had the sword in the other, and they had those that were guarding, and they had the trumpets, and when they heard they were coming, they would blow the trumpets, and they would come to where they kept all the time trying to prevent the building from taking place. But the bottom line, aside from all the work that was being done in the building of the wall, who really was responsible for the building of the wall? God was. Several times he says that. Where did all the supplies come from? The king. Artaxerxes made those things available. Where did all the food come from? Well, it's natural to say, well, the king provided that, but really, you see, as you read the chapters, Nehemiah provided that from his own resources. And it talks about the number of animals that were needed. He didn't let the king do the paying for the food, but all the supplies, the timbers and the rocks and all of those things were provided. And I said that in the opening lesson, going back as far as when the first group left and returned to Jerusalem under King Cyrus, the Persian that conquered the Babylonian Empire. God awakened his mind, or spoke to him, depending on what your translation says, and he sent them back. And why was it time to go back? Anybody? Why was it time to go back? And you're thinking, Brother Brent, you know the answer to that. Why are you asking? The 70 years were up. They were to go into captivity for 70 years because of their mistreatment of the land. You can read that in biblical text. But the 70 years were up. And when the 70 years were up, they went back. But they didn't go back all at once. We've talked about that before. Zerubbabel took a group back. Ezra took a group back. And here we are now with Nehemiah. And he takes a group back of some 43,000. And the building of the wall and the gates start. And on your map, did everybody get a map that had passed out enough maps? Where are my maps? I don't even have a map myself. Did I pass them all out? Boy, that's too bad. All right. So you have your map of the gates, and they just went from one to another. And as you look at the gates, and if you read in your scripture as it talked about building this gate and this gate and this gate, but when you think about the gates, when you think about the sheep gate, what do you think happened at the sheep gate? Make it easy. That's where the sheep went in and out. Pretty simple, isn't it? But really, not only did the sheep go in and out, it was the sheep that went in for the sacrifice. That's where they came in. It wasn't just a bunch of sheep running around inside the gates. That's the sheep that came in for sacrifice. And then over at the fish gate, what do you think's happening there? Well, that's where they sold fish. That was a sort of a market gate for fish. So they brought their fish there to be sold. Now the old gate is just an old gate. It doesn't say much about it, just one of the original gates that was there. Not much more said, just there it was. When you come down to the gate that says the furnace tower, well, what do you think they did? What was happening at the furnace tower? What do you think? It's what? I can't hear you.
Was that part of the fire for the altars?
No, it was fire. How about it's where they baked bread? They had the big ovens. We're in a city here. Not everybody had the make tag. Just plug it in and open up your oven. But this is where they baked bread for most of the city. And you read about it in Jeremiah, and it says they brought bread. He was in prison, and he was having bread and water. And they brought bread from Baker Street. Interesting, isn't it? You can read those things. But anyway, so those furnaces, I might say ovens makes it more understandable, but they had big ovens. It's where they did those things. And what about the valley gate? What do you think was happening there? They looked out on the valley. Isn't that, see how easy that is? And then we come around the corner, and we have the fountain gate. Well, what do you think was there? Fountains, water. People came from the city and they would get water. Not everybody had a well in their backyard, but that was one of the places where water was taken to the various places around the city. And then the refuge gate, or the dung gate, that's not too hard to figure out. That's where all the trash went. I don't know if they had people who went from house to house and picked up your trash. Wouldn't that be nice if they did? But somehow it was taken to that gate and disposed of. And then, of course, we have the other towers there. What do you suppose all the towers were about? There's the projecting towers. So they could see stuff coming, right? You could see way out who was coming your way. But right there is the water gate. Well, again, had pools. And then you come down to the horse gate. Make it easy. What do you think happened at the horse gate, Ray? And you're thinking the horse gate must have been where the horses went in and out. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's where the horses went. And really, we're talking about military. They didn't have just leisure horses, but the military horses, the people on horseback, they came in and out of that gate. And then up to the muster gate. Do you have another name for it? Did anybody's translation say soldier's gate? That's where anybody in the military? When you muster, what do? You get together. And that's what they did. That's where they got together to take the men out for battle. They mustered there. It was a soldier's gate. So all of these gates had a purpose, and the wall is being built and the gates are being assembled. But not only while the gates were being built and the wall was being built, what else was going on as you read the chapter? What else did you see in between things that were happening? Anybody? Did you see houses being built? Did you see debris being cleared? I mean, I wonder how much debris there would be from a wall that was 39 feet tall and 8 foot wide, and it just falling around everywhere. Quite a lot. So they had a lot to do in building and they built the wall, they built the gate, and there was some difficulty along the way as they built. And as they were doing their building, we're not looking at it verse by verse because it just says who built what gate. But as they did the building, as they began to build the wall and fix the gates, and what did their enemies continue to do? What is it? Mocked them for one thing. Despised. Anybody else have something? You have something else? Yeah, why are you rebelling against the king? Now, what didn't they know? It hadn't been revealed quite yet. But really, Nehemiah came under whose direction? Of the king. So he's really doing the king's work. And you look back, now, if what had happened, and I suppose in their day they would see the same thing, when you look back and see what was happening, really, who was allowing it to be built? Well, God was allowing it to be built, but from a human standpoint, who was allowing it to be built? The king. Artaxerxes II was allowing it to be built. He's providing for it to be built. And in the end, what did he know was going to happen? It's going to be completed. The gates are fixed, the walls are fixed, and, well, who's going to live there? Who's going to live there? The Jews. Which Jews? Go ahead. Benjamin and Judah. What happened to the other 12 tribes? Some of the ones are having problems with those that came back and intermarried, and they became known as the Samaritans, and all the people that lived around the region. They're the ones not wanting to have the walls built because, again, they're going to be excluded. It's going to be exclusive again. I don't know. I've taught this several times, and of course I've thought about it several times. What did the king know? So here's Nehemiah going back to be the governor of a very closed society. Benjamin, Judah, living in Jerusalem, and he's the governor of that region. Now, as we look at other chapters, we'll see where they settled different ones in different cities, around Jerusalem. But that's what he's governing. And the king must have known that. But still he builds with the king's approval, with God's approval. Oh, yeah. Well, there's no doubt. Yeah, I don't think there's any question, because you recall what he says, go that it may be well with myself and my sons. What if Artaxerxes said, nope, we're not going to do that. You're going to stay here and serve me coffee. Well, wine. You're not going to go back here and build. Just leave those people be. But it was God's word that he was following. And I try to stress that with Cyrus, send them back. With Darius, they're supposed to be there. Remember how he looked and found the old scrolls and so on? They're supposed to be there. Matter of fact, help them. So here we are, these years later. Help them. And he did. I don't know. We're going to see as the chapters develop. Can't look too far ahead. You'll be just sounding like review the next time you hear it, which is okay. If you hear it 5 times, it might catch on. But seriously, when it finally comes down and a few chapters later, and Nehemiah is talking to the people and he's giving them directions and so on, what did he find that happened? What was happening with the Jewish people that were living in the land? Chris has been talking about it in his evening study. They intermarried with the people. Nehemiah talks about that. Talks about their being faithful to the Lord. And as they read and declare the law, they declare that they're going to be faithful. But when Nehemiah comes back in a few years, what's he find? They're not faithful. Not only that, as you look in chapter 13, there's a non-Jewish man living in the temple. Was a relative of the high priest. Well, how do you get to be a relative of the high priest and not be a Jew? Had to be some intermarriage. But they were forced to leave and those kind of things. But again, back to our wall building and the gates. But as you listed through, we won't look at all that, but page by page or verse by verse, it tells you who was building what. And I think, as Steve mentioned, one of the things has to do with when they look back to the ancestry and who did this and who did this and who did this and who did this. It didn't just happen, but here's who did it and when it happened and how it happened. And when we look back today, we think about genealogy. Somebody mentioned that, maybe a couple mentioned genealogies. If you were going to claim some heritage as a Jew, you had to have your genealogy. You had to know where you belonged. And again, as I mentioned, and we'll look at it more closely in another lesson, there were some found that had no genealogy with the Jews, and they were forced to leave. But when you think about being a Christian, now, I know somebody taught us the gospel, that's a good thing. But think about it as your relationship with God. As a Jew, your relationship to God was traced out in the lineage, as far back as was necessary for your family. You could trace it. And one of the ways they did that, when you were born, they took you to the temple and registered your birth. Well, even Christ was registered for his birth. But still, when you think about being a Christian, what lineage do you have in your relationship with God? What is the lineage? And you're thinking, Brother Brent, that's too confusing. excuse me, there is no lineage. There's you and there's God. Now, again, did somebody teach you the gospel? Did your family teach you the gospel? Well, that could be true. A friend teach you the gospel, but you're not related to him biblically, spiritually, other than the fact he taught you as a teacher. But every one of us has the same relationship with God. Make sense? But when you think about the Old Testament period of things, let me say it again. What was the relationship? You were of this tribe, of this person. And you could trace step by step by step by step. Now, there were not supposed to be any continuation of the Jewish religion after the birth of Christ. I mean, after his crucifixion and resurrection. I mean, that was gone. Now, it did continue for a number of years, and some in more places than others, but it wasn't anymore. It was gone. And when the Romans came to Jerusalem in 70 AD, give me a little heads up here. What happened in 70 AD? Can you give us a hand there, Ron? What is it? Yeah, destroyed the temple. And if you read those historical documents about that, not only was the temple destroyed, it was scraped right down to the ground, and the rubble was put out in the sea so they could have a connection out there to an island, but there was nothing left other than what? You're thinking, well, that place where Rahab, it was never to be destroyed, and it's still there today. But what was destroyed by Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed? What was lost? Who said that? The genealogies. Yes, there you go. The genealogies were lost. And once the genealogies were lost, what could you no longer prove? Where you belonged in the overall Jewish scheme of things. And did it really make any difference where you belonged in the overall scheme of Jewish things? No. I see you shaking your head. You're right. No, it doesn't matter, because there's no special relationship for the Jews. I'm not an overt historian, but it is interesting that, after the war, the Second World War, a horrid thing happened with all the loss of life and the captivity of the Jews and so on. But after the war in 1949, when they kind of repatriated back to their land, who could be a Jew? Remember historically? Who could be a Jew at that time? Me. All you had to do is say, I'm a Jew, and two people agreed with you. Could they actually faithfully trace their lineage? No. So they just grew up in a family of this and this and this, and I'm not, being harsh in any way, but that was all done away with religiously. Religiously, all done away with. So here we are today, and your relationship to God is based upon your relationship with God. And when you teach somebody and they obey the gospel, right? I mean, they hear about Christ and the resurrection, and they believe in the resurrection and so on, and they are baptized into Christ, raised up to walk in newness of life. What happens? God adds you to his family, adds you to the church, as it says. Just pretty simple. But you're not in a family of something. I don't know the number of people I've taught and baptized through the years, but they're not related, are they? To me, the relationship is with God. But in the Old Testament period of things, the relationship was family. And you had to be able to prove what family you belonged to in order to live in a certain place. If I wanted, back before the time of being taken off in captivity, if I really wanted to live in a certain area, what did I have to be? You know, the 12 tribes of Jacob. If I wanted to live in a certain place in the land, I had to be of that particular tribe. I couldn't just go up there and say, I'm living here. No, lineage. So enough said about that, but it was important at the time that you know who you belong to, who your parents were, be able to trace all of that back to know what tribe you belong to. Now, a little later, you know, we won't talk about it now, but maybe another class, but when you think about Christ and his birth, really, who was he supposed to be related to right at the end? Well, what tribe was he supposed to be of? Tribe of Benjamin. How do they know that? How can you trace that? Well, here it is. What family? We'll talk about that another time. But anyway, this building of the gate, this putting together of the wall, all along, and of course we've talked about that, how they were discouraged. They didn't want it built. They even sent people to Nehemiah and said, your life is in danger. Your life is in danger. You need to come and live in the temple. You need to come and live, you know, and protect yourself. You need, you know, and several times they said that. What did he say? No, God protects. And he knew, it was revealed to him that it was just something they were making up. Can you imagine what would have happened if Nehemiah had left? If Nehemiah said, okay, I'm going over here and hide out because I'm afraid that all of those people that are working against us, they're going to come and take my life. You think that would have been encouraging or discouraging to the people doing the building? I've told you to stand out there and fight, but I'm going to go over here and hide. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. So he didn't do that. He stayed on the job. When we think about the complaints, the anger, the determination to stop them from building, I just have to think, there's nowhere in the scripture that it says, I know when they finish the wall, they're going to put me and my family outside. I know when the wall is completed and the gates are closed, that we're not going to have free access for trade like we do now. Once the wall is built and the gates are closed, we'll no longer be able to persecute the people as freely as we used to. So they'd wanted to do everything possible to keep them from building. And what did Nehemiah do? Kept right on building. Kept right on raising up the walls. And again, we're not talking about just a little flimsy thing here. We're talking about 2.5 miles worth of wall, on average 39 feet high and 8 feet wide. And I suppose along the way they built the rooms as they went. But nonetheless, they're doing the building. And how many, just give me a little help here, roughly how many do you think was helping with the building? It doesn't say every person that was helping, but how many came back with him? 42,000. Now, it doesn't say it had 42,000 people building, but you have to think that there were multiple thousands of people building. What kind of things might they have been doing? Well, some hauling away the rubbish, some refurbishing what could be used, some actually out there stacking the stones and putting in the mortar. But it was built. I was on a tour one time in Austria all those years ago. We talked about old forts that were built and castles and the big stone walls and things, and said really, they served very well until what was invented. gunpowder. And once they could launch bombs and drop bombs and have shells to shoot into the walls, I mean, think of all the, like Jerusalem being under siege. Under siege one time for 3.5 years. How do you stay under siege for 3.5 years? Well, you have supplies in there, of course, but you couldn't just open the gate and come in. Again, 8-foot walls, 8 foot thick, 39 feet high. And really many times they just stayed out in the camp and just waited and waited and waited. For what? For those inside to run out of water, to run out of food, and they just had to finally give up for their own preservation. But again, the walls were built. So anyway, it goes on to say about how it happened. I put down here on question number 7, what did Nehemiah refuse to partake of? And I put down to eat the king's food and paid for it himself. Now, I don't know if you think about that in your own life, when you're involved in doing certain, for lack of better terminology, certain religious projects, is it okay for you to pay for it yourself? Suppose that's where you can do that? You suppose everything that's done by the church needs to be paid for from the treasury? I mean, most of it is. But can't you do it yourself? Can't you just say, I'm going to do this? And if you're doing this, do you have to let everybody know that, you know, I've been over here doing such and such, and so far it's only costing me $150 a week? I just wanted you to know that. I mean, we don't have to advertise it, do we? A matter of fact, when Christ talked about that, what did he say about it? About doing it in secret, not declaring it. But he's saying to the people, I'm doing this myself. It's not the king, because they were probably asking. But doesn't it become, when it becomes known that you've been doing such and such, I don't know how to make it sound right, but do people have a greater appreciation for you sometime when they find out all the stuff you've been doing after the fact? I think they do. And I think that's kind of how it was with Nehemiah. He was paying it himself. Would the king have paid? Said he would. The king said he would pay. When you get down to the next question, how did Nehemiah respond to the letters that he received? We talked about that just a little bit. He kept getting letters and letters and letters, even down to the 5th time. When he got it the 5th, you know, why didn't he respond? Why didn't he say, okay, I quit? Because he was on a mission for who, bottom line? Whose work was he doing? God's work. And if we're doing God's work, I don't know. I've been doing church work about 50 years. You suppose there are times when things didn't go just exactly the way I'd like them to go? You suppose there have been times when people that I thought were close friends really were working against me? Is that possible? Found that to be true too. But what do you do? The right thing. What are you saying, Steve? There you go. Keep doing what you know God wants you to do. And that's the same thing we're seeing here with Nehemiah. Hear what he was supposed to do. And he continued to do those things that he was given direction by God to do. Now, I'll be the first to say, I've never been sitting up in the night reading a Agatha Christie book. Anybody read Agatha Christie? I've never been reading a book and I get this, Dick, I want you to go down to Georgia. Well, I've never had anything like that. I mean, how do we know that we're supposed to be doing and working and being involved in God's work? It tells us to. But it doesn't say exactly, you go here and you go here and you go here and you go here. Now, biblically, they had some New Testament things where they were told exactly where to go. But we're to go into where? All the world. Where is that? Everywhere. It might be across the street.
I think some of us are drawn to different places.
I was going to say that. Yeah, I think that's true. You know, if you have a certain interest in a certain thing in a certain kind of environment, that you would like to go there. I sweat. Not crude, don't be crude. But I sweat quite easily, see, even on my lip. And it's what, 70 degrees in here? I would have to get some kind of direct message with skywriting. Dick Brandt, you are going to Johannesburg, South Africa this afternoon. Your address is, your social security. It would have to be something pretty plain for me to go where it's hot. You know, we did mission work in Canada 21 years, and the place that we lived in the winter was about 30. In the summer, it was about 70. Right on the coast, nice breeze most days. Most days it rained also, 160 inches a year. But see, that was a nice place for me. I liked it there. But here's Nehemiah being told what to do. And that's what he did. This is the way that you're going to happen. This is what's going to happen. We already talked last week. He already went out and looked things over, right? He already out and saw the condition of things. And what we have, as we read in chapter 3, especially, is who worked on what gate. You suppose he had any idea of who was capable of what families were involved, and what this person could do, and he could work with this because it's not as great a task as working over here? I think he had some idea of who could do what. I also like the one that said, and his daughters. You ever think about the daughters working on the wall? Is there work for everybody in the Lord's kingdom? Not maybe that you want to bake me bread every day now that the tower is fixed. But seriously, we all have things that we can do. And sometimes, appreciate what Steve is saying, sometimes we have the idea that, well, I can't do what Bill does. I'm so encouraged by what he does, but I just can't do that. Well, whoop-de-doo. How about something else? And as you read it in the scripture, it says that we have different skills, we have different abilities. And God has given us according to, and some of this and some of this. We all have different things, but make no mistake, we have something. And does it change from time to time as you get older? The works and things that you were able to be involved with when you were 25, is it different when you're 50? Is it different when you're 60 and 70 and I'm not supposed to say 80? But really, things change. But as a teacher, material doesn't change. Might be a different illustration, in keeping with the day, but the material never changes. If you want to be a teacher for the Lord, you just have so much to learn. I've said before about New Testament, forgiveness under the New Testament period of time. There's just a few things to learn. If you're going to teach somebody about baptism, you ready? 13 verses. Can you learn 13 verses? It tells you who, what, when, and pretty simple. If you think about the Lord's Supper on the first day of each week, the Lord's Supper on the first day of each week, how many verses say that? 1. Pretty simple. They came together on the first day of the week to break bread. You've heard me say that. And the Greek text is mono sabbato, 1 of 7. So what does that exclude? Well, that excludes the 4 of 7 or the 3 of 7 or the 2 of 7. It's just on the 1 of 7. So, but anyway, you'll have a place. You'll have a place if you want a place. You may have to think about a place where your service will be. You may have to look and see something that's not being done. Well, if there's something that's not being done and you see that, let me encourage you to talk to the elders and say, could I do such and such? They may have thought about that already and are trying to work that out and making the plan. But hey, maybe they haven't thought about that. Don't be afraid to speak up. I mean, thinking about my next door neighbor. We've been living there a while, and it's been cold and they've been inside and it's been rainy and just different things over the time, but we see them, we wave a little bit. Well, I'm standing out of the yard yesterday when I came back, and she's out there with her kids. And we're talking about different things, and I said, my granddaughter has 4 kids about the age of your children. I said she doesn't have any set of twins, but they're about the same age. I looked at a boy and said, he's 6 and Zach's that age, and and the girls. And I said, they live in Tennessee. She said, whereabouts in Tennessee? I said, they live near Henderson, Tennessee. Oh, whereabouts is it close by there? I said, well, it's just 40 minutes from Jackson. She said, yeah, but what is the name of the city? And what is the name? What is it? Bethel Springs. I went in, I didn't know the exact name because I hadn't thought about it for a while, so I got Deanna to print off a label, and I gave it to her, and she said, Bethel Springs? That's my hometown. That's where I grew up. Small world. So I gave her the label. I said, well, send my granddaughter a card and tell her that we're neighbors. So we've got a little opening there. We'll talk about things. Just never know how it'll develop. But there could be opportunity. 4 kiddos that need to hear the gospel in the future. She needs to hear it now. Her husband worked for Phillips. I can't think of his name right now. But I guess everybody works for Phillips. But no, not everybody. But a lot of people. So you just never know the opportunities you'll have. And I think about the gates as the time ends. I don't know if anybody looked back on their part of the building of the gates, and when the assignments were passed out, my family was given the sheep gate. What an honor to rebuild the gate in that section of the wall where the sacrificial lambs come in, where the sheep and the offerings come in, and they go right into the temple. What an honor. And when I talk to my grandchildren, and I can say, and built the sheep gate. But old George over here, George's not here, that's just arbitrary. His family was the one that rebuilt the refuge gate. They're down there, they built the dung gate. May not, in the mind of some, have the honor of the sheep gate. But how badly was the refuge gate needed? Needed just as much. I mean, all the stuff of the city, all the trash, out there in the valley, and the pool gate and those things, yeah. But somebody had to work around over there with the horse gate. I don't know where the Lord is finding you or where you're finding yourself in your work with the Lord, but it may not be the end of it. There may be other things. But whatever it is now, do it with your full force that you're able. And if you're not able to carry on as much as you were in the past, let me suggest you find an assistant, somebody to help you that you can train. Questions, comments? I'm out of film, so I have to quit. Thank you for your attention.